We're talking about David. So far, we've covered 6 of the major Old Testament covenants Jehovah God made with individuals. And before you read on, what were they? 1, Eden. 2, Adam and Eve. 3, Noah. Good. 4, Abraham. 5, Moses. 6, Joshua. Because we're up to David tonight. Well done. Good. We began in the Garden of Eden. We began with the Garden of Eden covenant before sin entered the world. Second was the covenant with Adam and Eve in a world affected by sin, death, and decay, the beginning of the age of conscience. Next, Noah's covenant gave a new start to mankind with a cleansed earth and the setting up of human government. And it would be great if the story says that human beings could stay true to God from that point onwards. But as we know, they didn't. Moses set out Jehovah's righteous standards for Israel, thus entering into an age of law. Even his generation failed to keep that agreement due to their evil heart of unbelief. When Joshua finally entered the promised land, the people agreed to conquer and cleanse it, and then bring rest to his land at God's designated times. Do you remember what those times were? The seal for the covenant with Moses was the 7th day of rest, so the Sabbath day rest. And for Joshua, God added 2 other rest periods for the land. 7th year and 50th Jubilee year, celebration year. God made a covenant of promises with Abraham through faith and obedience. In this session, we continue with Jehovah's covenant with David after the death of King Saul, but before David was enthroned in Israel. As we have discovered in the past covenants, this one too pointed to the coming Messiah. It previewed his eternal throne, an everlasting king, a righteous people who had chosen God as their own. So again, that's where God is headed. He's after a people of his own who choose to love him, who choose to follow him out of a pure heart, out of a heart that delights to do what God wants. So he's still after that. So along comes David, and the Bible says that David was a man after God's own heart. So David was a shepherd boy. Remember all the stories about David being the shepherd boy? And God chose him as the next king of Israel. Capital B, the scene for for David's covenant. The scene for David's covenant. Number 1, a review of the history past. Last week, we saw that Israel could have entered the land in 40 days. Isn't that interesting? They could have been in the promised land in a month and a week, 40 days. However, Psalms 90, 78 and 106 record their ungrateful murmurings and complaints. Moses' law covenant exposed the human heart's helplessness and inability to keep God's law apart from his grace. Jehovah planned to use Israel to show other nations his redemptive purposes, his character, and his way of life. But Israel failed to obey. So again, the heart was not touched, even though there was a huge, long list of laws that God set out for the people to do. Still, their heart wasn't touched. Last week we saw Moses and the people ready to enter the land and conquer their enemies. Israel had many great victories, and sad to say, many great defeats. And Joshua proved faithful. The 12 tribes were assigned their portion in the land, and they set about building a new nation. Jehovah planned to clean out the wicked pagan practices of idolatry and child sacrifice from the land of Canaan, and to provide a holy land where the Messiah would bring in the new covenant. So one of the reasons that God gave the Canaan land to Israel, as we talked about before, was all the defilement, the degradation of the pagan religions that was there in the land of Canaan. And some of their practices we probably see in the in the coven practices, witchcraft practices today. So they were not a moral people. And then the second reason why God gave Israel the land was that he wanted to provide a stable place so he could bring in the Messiah. Because if there was no stable land, then the Messiah couldn't come. So it meant the whole timetable then would have to be shifted. So God was after a stable land for the Messiah to come. However, we also know that the people failed to keep this covenant by not conquering all the land. So, we now continue the covenant story. The covenant story. This period in Old Testament history can be divided into three major divisions. Three major divisions. And I put a map there to show where the 12 tribes settled in the land of Canaan. Notice that Manasseh, I didn't realize until I drew this, until I looked up this map. Notice how much Manasseh has? Remember, Ephraim and Manasseh were the sons of Joseph, and so so Manasseh got a double portion. So poor old Benjamin, Zebulun, Issachar didn't do too well in the whole bits of when the land was parceled out. However, it could be that the ones who didn't get very good land, that didn't get very much land, theirs was very good land, particularly if it was around the water supplies. So there are the 12 tribes in the land that they were given. It's interesting if you take this map, and if you know anything about the struggles that are going on over in Israel right now, how much of this has present-day Israel claimed back? Does anybody know, seen a map recently of where the struggles are? Well, most of the struggles are along what's called the Golan Heights. So in the middle of the map is the Dead Sea and the Salt Sea, and there's a line that runs down between the two of them. That's the Jordan River, and right along that crest is the Golan Heights. So where are they struggling today? Right along where Manasseh's land would have been, Manasseh, and a bit of where Benjamin's land would have been. So has Israel claimed back all the land that God promised to them today? No.
They pretty well did after that 12-day war, didn't they?
They claimed a fair bit, but they still haven't gotten back the land where Simeon was given, or the second half of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, where their land is.
I thought they went right down to the Egypt and the Nile land. They had to get some they did at that time.
Yeah. Although I don't think they did the whole lot there of Judah's. I'll see if I can find a map, because that would be good for the very last one of the covenant, the everlasting covenant, to see how much of the land Israel's at right now. So I'll see if I can find a map for you.
Is it still on God's agenda then?
Good question. What do you think? Bible scholars have debated that, whether it's still on God's agenda. I would suspect so, because he gave all that land to Israel. And it was conditional on their faithfulness to him. So if the Jewish nation turned to God wholeheartedly, God would start driving out their enemies. Yeah. So, and it could be that's Sharon's tactics now. Don't know. But the land they have now is, if I remember right, somewhere around 3/4 of what God promised them. So they haven't claimed it all back yet.
As you said the other week, God gave them to the descendants of Abraham, which are the Arabs as well, aren't they?
Yes.
So it won't mean the Arabs have got to clear out.
Well, that's one way to look at it. Of course, Bible scholars have sat around and argued these sort of points for a long time. If this land was given to the 12 tribes, it'll be interesting to see if they get all their land back again. But that's an interesting point, that it was to the Arabs that some of it was given as well, the Promised Land. And they certainly claim it. That's the roots of all this conflict that's going on. The first section of history the first section of the history of Israel is contained in the books of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, bringing Israel into the Promised Land and listing their conquests for some 400 years. So it took them about 400 years, and even at that they didn't fully conquer way back then. Jehovah's plan was to drive out the inhabitants. The people's disobedient and willful heart defeated his plan. Instead, the book of Judges shows their defeat and the stumbling around in their unfaithfulness. So God planned to give them the land and to just drive out their enemies and ahead of them. Remember, they weren't supposed to take any more land than where they actually put their feet on the land. In other words, God didn't completely clear out the land and then give them 400 years to conquer it back again. Because the wild animals would have taken over, the cities would have gone to ruin, the vineyards would have been destroyed. So God gave them only the portion where they put their feet and what they conquered. Which is an interesting spiritual type for where we're at today, too. In our spiritual land, God only gives us what we have possessed our own land right now. During this time, God's chosen nation exhibits the beginnings of the continual, repeated 5-step pattern. We talked a little bit about this a couple of sessions ago. So first of all, Israel began to follow the pagan neighbors and fall into idolatry. Their sin results in some form of servitude to a foreign nation. They cry out to God in their torment. He provides salvation through a king, and later on a judge, and later on through a king. Then the people in the land enjoy a period of silence and rest. And that was the pattern that they went through 7 major times before David and the kings began to happen. So 7 times they went through that. Now, how does that translate to us today? Can you see some sort of a pattern for Christians today? What do you think? See how much you pick up types and shadows.
I just feel, and what the thoughts are, that so much of what we see, like in the map and the reclaiming, is a physical, a worldly example.
Yes.
But through Christ, we do that
Yes.
in a spiritual sense.
Very true.
Because we can have, well, I just think of, I read in the paper this morning, we opened the case of a young girl, Eloise, that's disappeared. And the mother said that she had, it said, I don't know, that the mother had found through a spiritual way. It didn't say, it just said a spiritual way that she has come to peace and she's at rest, with the way that even if she doesn't find her daughter, she knows. So she's entered that rest. She's entered that silence and rest. So spiritually you can enter what God was showing them physically. And for us to reflect that, I think, is to give us a physical awareness of the spirituality.
Yes. Yes, you're on the right track. That's right. Yes. So how does this 5-step pattern apply to our life today? Do we do the same thing?
So that's not so much a negative, it's the wrong word, but to me that's a negative cycle and a negative pattern.
Very.
So then there's a consequence, there should be a positive pattern.
Good.
Well, somewhere in there.
Yes, I like that. Keep going.
Well, just one where there's this pattern of wherever I've got a challenge, like for example, like Joshua and Jericho, there's that pattern of conquering, and there's the steps of, well, I got to this place, it's a challenge, now I come to the Lord, He gives me a strategy, I overcome it, I enter the next challenge, you know what I mean? As opposed to, I fall into sin, you know, I feel condemned, I ask God for forgiveness, and then, you know, I move into, you know, He cries out, and then I get some rest again. You know?
Yes.
So, is that fair?
That's good. It's exactly what I was after, because often Christians go through that sort of a cycle. They yield to something that they know they shouldn't be doing, or that's not good for them, or God's taught them not to do it, and they start around the cycle. So we yield to something, and what we yield to begins to control us, gets up on top of us, begins to control us. We cry out to God for an answer, get us out of this predicament that we're in. He does. He provides some sort of salvation, whether a word or someone's encouragement, someone's prayer, whatever. And then the land and the people, we enjoyed a period of rest in the Lord. And so to turn that cycle around, what was their downfall was the idolatry. So when we come up against a challenge, to make sure that we don't fall for whatever that challenge is and go into the slavery and servitude ourselves. Good. Exactly where we were at. Israel repeated this cycle 7 times before King Saul. 7 times. So think about the patience of God. And just again and again and again the people went through this, and God was so patient. So that's the first major section of history. The second major division of history is recorded in the kingdom books. These are the books 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It is this period of history when we are introduced to David, the shepherd boy, anointed as king over the growing tribes of Israel. However, even a series of God-appointed kings could not keep the people's heart soft toward Jehovah. Because Israel failed in their covenant, he had no other choice but to exile them for 40 years. So they followed the cycle again and again and again, and there was no other choice but to send Israel into exile. Have you run across Christians who are in exile out in the middle of the wilderness? Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's for that same reason. In the third division of their history, God's people are allowed by him to return to their homeland. The people were then given the unshakable messages of the prophets. This time period lasted 125 years until the Old Testament closes in 400 BC. 3. David's time in history. Well, the people wanted a king. Just like the nations around us, they began to demand to have a king. From promises made in past covenants, Jehovah did wish to establish a kingship line. However, he had a theocracy, monarchy in mind, not a secular one. And what's a theocracy? By God. There are about 5 different kinds of governments. Did we do this in the first session? Doesn't say, it might have been one of those things Daniel deleted. There are about 5 different kinds of leadership government rule. One is a rule by old men, and it's called a genofocracy, something like that, Geno, theocracy, and so that's by old wise men. A government by females is a monarchy. A government by the people for the people is a democracy. But it still has power groups that see what happens that they get their own will. A theocracy is where God is in charge.
So when you said about the women,
Mm-hmm.
you said monarchy.
Mm-hmm. So that's a government where the rulership is by a woman. Like Queen Elizabeth and the queens, that would have been a monarchy. Mm-hmm. Sorry? What am I after? Well, unless it's, the patriarchal government is by men, so a matriarchal, there we go, a matriarchal, that's right, sorry about that, a matriarchal government is by women. And patriarchal is by men. Mm-hmm.
And the last one is people for the people. What was that one again?
Democracy.
It's an evolution.
Sorry? Okay, what have you got so far? You've got by old wise men, by women, by men, by God.
Wise men, democracy, matriarchal theocracy.
Unless wise men is separate from old men, it might be what it is. That.
No, you didn't add patriarchal before.
Okay.
So if you've got your old men, your patriarchal, your matriarchal, democracy, and theocracy.
And theocracy. Okay, there are your 5. Did you find it, Jan? Did we do that somewhere?
Session 3.
Huh. Session 3. So last week, session 3? Did I get them right? So did I get them right? Was it the 5?
Yeah, but it wasn't the, you didn't have the single life of a woman, male and female, you had the
Monarchy, oligarchy. Good. Well, I was almost right. Do you like? Yeah.
So say it again.
C-O.
G.
Oh, did you get the O-N? C-O.
G-O.
C-O-3-Y. So
E.
Gerontocracy.
Gerontocracy. Good.
C-R-A-C-Y.
Is that in session 3, is it?
That was second. No, but in the last module. Not this module.
So in the faith, covenants of our faith.
Well, we didn't have them right, and it wasn't patriarchal and matriarchal.
No, it was oligarchy and a monarchy.
What's an oligarchy?
Who actually thinks up these names?
Webster's Dictionary. Was back in session 3. Was that number 1? Session 3?
The foundations of our faith.
Yes.
Section 3.
Creation and fall of man. That looks familiar. How about I just give it to you, and rather than take the time to spell it and all of that. Born into a world of pain. Page 3. 2, 3. Whoops. How about you catch me at the break and I'll see if I can find it for you. So session 3, page 7. Oh, no wonder I couldn't find it. Page 7, session 3, for those people who are listening on tape, and I hope you find it better than I find it. How about I see if I can find it during the break for you? Or even go tap on Paul's shoulder and say, can I get that from you, please? But it was session 3, page 7. All right. So we talked about a theocracy. So God wanted a kingship because that's where the Messiah was coming through, and the everlasting king. However, due to their cycles of disobedience, Israel did not wait for God's timing to establish this kingdom. They jumped ahead of God instead, electing Saul to be their king. After the disobedience of Saul towards God regarding his instructions about dealing with the Amalekites, Jehovah chooses a shepherd boy, David, son of Jesse. Jehovah had already taught David many lessons which would help him in the role of king. The prophet priest Samuel anointed David even before Saul leaves the throne. The deep bond between David and Saul's son Jonathan creates tension as Saul and David is forced to leave the palace running for his life. See, David passed God's test of honoring King Saul, by now murderous in his heart toward David. As Israel's true leader, David does not take justice into his own hands, but waits for God's timing for him to be king. It is with David that the age of prosperity and the growth of Jehovah's nation develops. Although David's heart may have been soft toward God, his rule was one of the most glorious victories and resounding calamities. So even David was not perfect toward God. David led his people into worshiping Jehovah and restoring the proper order of the tabernacle. He also honored God by his military victories. David designs and wants to build God a permanent home in a temple instead of the tabernacle of Moses. So remember when they were in the wilderness, they had this big tent that they pulled down, rolled up, put in the cart, and took with them every time they moved. So this was the tent that they still had erected for God. Now, while we're on that spot, how about turn over to Appendix B. And I did some research for us on the tabernacle of Moses and the temple of Solomon. The tabernacle, a temporary dwelling place of Jehovah, was a tent made according to the pattern of the temple in heaven. So Moses was given this pattern. God gave it to him based on a pattern in heaven. There are types and shadows in the material that were used, the colors, the intricate details of God's perfection in planning. So you can do a study right from the beginning of the design of what it was made out of, the different colors that it was made from, the use of gold and silver and wood, all say something. In it we see the perfection of his dwelling place. So and by studying the plan of the tabernacle, you can see the perfection of God's dwelling place, the history of Israel, Jesus' life and death our Christian walk, the church throughout history, basic doctrines, the process of cleansing, renewal of the Spirit, work of the counterfeit Antichrist, the coming together of the true bride, the patterns of restored truth, and the feasts given to Israel. So for those people who love to get themselves immersed in types and shadows and patterns, you can take the feasts, you can take the tabernacle, you can take hundreds of different things that are in the Old Testament, the going into the promised land, the pattern of leadership, and you can apply all those different principles and learn about God's perfection of order. So in the tabernacle, it talks about God's dwelling place, the history of Israel, talks about Jesus' life and death, talks about our Christian walk, talks about the church throughout history, talks about basic doctrines, and so on and so forth. So what I thought I'd do is have you draw your own temple, tabernacle there on that page where you're at. So, first of all, was it a square? No, it was oblong. So it was about that shape. And it was basically divided into 3 portions. Do you remember what the 3 were? The outer court. Okay. So all of this was the outer court, all along the outside boundaries. So all of this was the outer court. Now in the outer court, who could go into the outer court? Israel, yes. Who else? Women. Isn't that amazing? So women and Gentiles and Jews were allowed into the outer court. Now there was a gate there, so there was a gate that kept out. So however you want to show, but that's the gate. That was the marking point coming into the tabernacle.
So did the outer court go behind the Holy of Holies?
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, so there was the outer court. Then there was another rectangle inside, and that one's not going to work. Another rectangle inside of that. Whoops, it was a little bit bigger than that. About that size. And that was divided into 2 parts, and what was that? The holy place and the Holy of Holies. So all along the outside then, this was the outer court. So just so I've got room to put all of this on. Holy of Holies, Holy of Holies, and the holy place. Now inside of that, there was a veil. So again, it was divided into thirds, so there was a veil between the 2. All right, now I've written down some of the furniture that was there for you to mark on your design as you go through. So the first thing, when you came in through the gate, you ran into, any idea what it was? Anybody that knows anything about the tabernacle? The altar of sacrifice. So right here was the altar of sacrifice. So the first thing that you did when you walked in through the door was what? Sacrifice. Mm-hmm. First thing you come into the presence of God, you learn about His sacrifice, which is Jesus. So that was the altar of sacrifice. And on your paper, it's A. So that was there. Then after the altar of sacrifice, well, let's read through this just really quickly. It was brass overlaid of acacia wood, where the animals were slain and the ceremony was done. The prominent position of the slaughtering place represents the cross, and Jesus' sacrifice of His blood and body were used to redeem the world. And then from there, B, you ran into the brazen laver, used by the priest to wash before entering the holy place. The mirrored service, all the women of Israel gave the priests their little mirrors that they took with them from Egypt. So the whole inside of the surface was all these little mirrors. The mirrored surface gave a glimpse of how God saw them, reinforcing our need for daily cleansing of His Word before entering God's presence, the washing of the water of the Word. So that was the next thing. That was around, evidently quite big from what the designs tell us. So that's B, that's the laver. So you came in through the gate, went through the sacrifice system, just like we do with the Lord. And then the next thing was the laver, the cleansing aspect, before you can go through into the holy place. Now number 2 was the holy place. So this was number 1, the outer court. And number 2 was the holy place. Who went into the holy place? The priests. So the whole of the Levitical priesthood could go in and do the duties inside the holy place. Now inside there, it was made out of gold. So notice that you start out with wood and brass, and then it goes into gold, which is more... 2, 3, sorry. Was a stem, yep, had 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 candlesticks or lampstands. This gave light to the holy place and to the priest, and the light came from olive oil. So what does olive oil speak of? The Holy Spirit. It was used to signify the oil of the anointing of the Spirit of God. All was made of beaten gold. The flowers, the bowls showed the perfection of Christ, who is the light of the world. So you can see the types and the shadows even in the whole of the furniture that's in there. Okay, keep going on. Number D, or little d, the golden table of showbread. So there was a table, and it had 12 loaves of bread on it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Why would God have a table of bread in there? What did the 12 signify? The 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 loaves represent the 12 tribes of Israel. The bread was used in connection with the drink and meal offering. Does that ring a bell for what Christians do? Communion. This speaks of fellowship around the Lord's table in remembrance of His sacrifice. This was a constant reminder of God, of His covenant relationship with the Messiah. And then, of course, Jesus passed through the fierce ovens of Calvary and became our perfect living bread. Then outside of the veil was E, the golden altar of incense. So there was an altar right in front of the veil. Are you keeping up with me okay? So that was D. So A, B, C was the candlesticks, D was the altar. The golden altar of incense was placed just before the veil in direct line of approach to the mercy seat. It represents Christ, who is at the throne of God making intercession for us. The altar speaks of prayer, praise, worship, and intercession. And then F was the veil. So we've talked about the veil. That was F. The veil separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, necessary to conceal God's glory from mortal humans. At Jesus' death, this veil was torn in two, God clearing the way to Himself, all obstacles removed from mankind. The veil and other parts of the tabernacle hung from poles set in silver sockets, where silver represent the redemptive brought back work of Jesus. And then inside, what was the third part was the Holy of Holies. What was in the Holy of Holies? Mercy seat. But that's where God dwelt. Yep. So that's where the actual presence, the Shekinah glory of God was. And inside that was the Ark of the Covenant. And it stood within God's presence, beaten gold overlay. This included the golden mercy seat, which would speak of what? Why would we need a mercy seat? To claim God's forgiveness and His mercy, true. with two overshadowing cherubims, the guardians of the complete work of Jesus. The ark contained the 2 tablets of stone, the book of the law, a golden pot of manna from their wilderness journey, a picture of the Christ we serve, and Aaron's rod that budded, an emblem of God's chosen priesthood. So inside was the ark. Now I'm not even going to begin to draw it with the cherubim and well, I'll just try. That's supposed to be cherubim underneath it. So you do better than mine. So each of the pieces of the furniture represented something for our own walk and for all the different aspects that you can read into the types and shadows.
In the book on the covenant, and he said that I'd never known before that, that all the laws were written and the book was put open beside the ark there.
So that it was on display?
Yeah, but I didn't know that.
No, I didn't either. I would have thought it was inside the ark because it was only the high priest that went in once a year. So it could have been open. You probably have to...
Because I thought they were the tablets inside. But this, he said that the book was written out.
Yes,
You know, Moses
all
wrote
the
it.
laws
Yeah.
on the stone
It
tablets.
was put beside.
Well, I've always thought that it was inside, but yeah, all right.
In the Catholic religion, do they sort of follow similar to that with having a pope?
Yeah, the Pope is supposedly descended from Peter, goes all the way back to Peter the Apostle, but an authority structure that comes down from that. Yeah. And then the other interesting thing that I found when we were doing types and shadows is the feasts of the different feasts that God told the people to have are also types and shadows for us today. So there were 7 main feasts given to Israel, which we can apply to the Christian walk. The first was the Feast of Passover. Speaks of our redemption, of the cross, the work of Jesus. We came out from the world, delivered into a new life. So remember, Passover was what Israel was to celebrate because the angel of death passed over them, and they came out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. So the Feast of Passover speaks of our salvation experience. Then during that Passover celebration was to be a feast of unleavened bread, which speaks of our obedience to God's laws, not our turning from the sin of our Egypt, our baptism in the Holy Spirit. Then first fruits was one of the next feasts that they were given, speaks of Jesus and our new resurrection life, where we are His first fruits of a new harvest. Then the 4th day was the feast day of Pentecost, when the promise of the Father, the Holy Spirit, was given to His church. 5th was the Feast of Trumpets, speaks of the charismatic renewals for the church, as a call, 2 Peter 1:10, as a call for service and worship of God, for atonement and warfare, unity, and a call to prepare for the end days. The Feast of Atonement was for the obedience and cleansing, and that's what the high priest went through for his people. So Jesus has gone through the Feast of Atonement for us. And then number 7, the Feast of Tabernacles reminded the people of His completion. From Zephaniah, His completion, peace, and our rest by walking in the Spirit. So again, you can take those feast days and you can go through that list that I began with up on top by the tabernacles. You can talk about the history of Israel, the life, death of Jesus, Christian walk, our church throughout history, basic doctrines, because it talks about baptism and redemption and sanctification and all those other big words that has to do with our Christian walk. Talks about the renewal of the Spirit, process of cleansing, the counterfeiting work of the Antichrist, the coming together of the true bride, restoring the truth back to the church, and of course the physical feast that God gave them to remember why they did what they did. So you can see, you can get lost in types and shadows, and it just goes on and on and on and on. Yep?
Do you have a perspective on all this? It just,
A perspective?
Yeah, well, it just seems complicated. and there's types and shadows and stuff like that. So I'm just trying to understand. I mean, I obviously wouldn't understand everything, but why would God put all this in place?
Why would God put it all in place? Somebody else like to answer that?
Well, Jesus hadn't come yet, I suppose.
So God was teaching them, yes, preparing them for the Messiah. It's like he laid down design after design after design after design just to repeat the truth again and again and again and again. That everywhere you look, from the tabernacle to the feast days to the priest's clothes, the reasons why they did what they did, all speak again and again and again of certain basic patterns. So once you begin to see the patterns, it's not quite as confusing as it looks right now. Does that help? So it's basically to help us thick human beings get the truth in. God tells us again and again and again through all different kinds of examples and yeah.
And when the Messiah did come, they were supposed to realise that they weren't link it up.
Yes, yes. And had they been open to let God teach them, yes. Although there were some of the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests that did recognize Jesus and could see all this beauty and the intricate work that God had put into it. But yes, it was to help Israel understand that when the Messiah came, he'd have to do certain things. And then I forgot to say that around the tabernacle were camped all the different 12 tribes of Israel. So each one had their assigned place. So you had, that's a tent, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So God had an order for the tents for the children of Israel, for the Israelites to be camped as well. Interesting. So tuck that away somewhere for your thinking process. Okay, where are we back to? So, David passed God's test. He led his people in worship to Jehovah. We're down to E. David commits adultery with Bathsheba, kills her husband Uriah. As a result, their firstborn son by Bathsheba is allowed to die. Conflict continues between David's son and their place in his kingdom. Absalom's rebellion gives us all lessons to avoid. His vanity and lust for power corrupt his heart, and he dies a wasted death. The conflict continues now within the military camps. David takes a census of the people and pays a heavy price for his disobedience. He was given a choice. He could have 3 days of plague. God gave him a choice. He had 3 days of plague. He could have 3 years of war, or he could have something else that was a 3. And he chose the 3 days, 3 months of drought, was it? Of doubt.
But it's interesting, when I read that, it says that the Lord incited him to take a census. So it really wasn't David's idea, it was the Lord that told him to, because he wanted to deal with the Israelites.
Yeah, so it could have been the way that David did it was not what God wanted. But God wanted him to do it, but he did it in the wrong way. Yeah, because otherwise it wouldn't have been just that God then punished David and the people. So there must have been some sin in there. F, David had shed so much blood in killing Uriah and in all the wars, Jehovah wouldn't let him build the temple. 1 Chronicles 22:8, but gives that job to Solomon. As David slips from power, struggles grow between Adonijah and Solomon. David leaves his last stage of life with a victory song, a fitting close to the life of a king who was a man after God's own heart.
So that's Psalm 18, the last Psalm here, the Psalm.
Yes, in a different order in Psalms, but yes. So that's the victory psalm. G, in moving from David's reign in the golden age of Solomon, Israel begins a new and glorious chapter in their history. Perhaps with all the wealth at their fingertips, the people just might remain true to Jehovah. What do you think? Did that happen? No, in fact, after Solomon, we see the kingdom splitting into two groups. The northern kingdom of 10 tribes went after Rehoboam, and that was one of Solomon's sons. The southern tribe goes after Jeroboam with 2 tribes. The division was a direct result of Solomon's idolatry. During his time, Israel's worship and loyalty to Jehovah is increasingly corrupt and idolatrous. The nation's moral and religious fiber declines, and Jehovah carries out his righteous judgments as a result. The Old Testament books of Kings and Chronicles records a united, stable kingdom under a strong king, under Solomon. However, at the end of the chapter in Israel's history is in total collapse and mass deportation. The northern kingdom, known as Israel, is taken into Assyria in 721 BC. The southern kingdom of Judah goes into Babylon 606 BC. 70 years would pass before they returned again. And they would be a changed and repentant people. Any comments?
Just on the point of the census, there's even census this year in Australia, August. There's nothing wrong with census, I presume, is there?
Well, what I think was in the back of David's mind, and who else would be taking a census, is, okay, how many strong men do I have in my army so that I can conquer my enemy, rather than saying, well, God is my mighty source. If he tells me to conquer the enemy, we will. So I see it as a sign of the kings relying on their own strength rather than on God's strength. A sense of pride, a sense of, we've got more men than they do, so we're going to have the victory. And there were many times in Israel's history when that was not the case. They had fewer men and they had the greater victory. Or they had more men and they had the lesser victory, depending on how obedient there was in their heart. What'd you find?
Maria was saying before was, it says, 21 says, Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel.
So it wasn't God.
And Joab, who was his commander, told him he shouldn't do it. He overruled him. His command, he said it was evil in the sight of God, so he punished Israel. David said, I have sinned greatly by doing this. Now I beg you to take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. The Lord said to Gad, David's here, go and tell David, this is what the Lord says, I'm giving you 3 options, choose one of them for me to carry out against you. So Gad went to David and said, this is what the Lord says, take your choice, 3 years of famine, 3 months of being swept away before your enemies, and their swords overtaking you, or 3 days with the sword of the Lord. Days of plague in the land, the angel of the Lord ravaging every part of Israel. Now then decide how I should answer, the Lord has sent me. David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. Let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is very great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell dead.
70,000 men fell dead. That's a lot. I suppose that probably the biggest lesson that I see coming out of that is that leaders really need to know what they're doing and be really careful, because not only do they suffer, but the people who follow suffer as well. So 70,000 men. Yeah. And that probably didn't include women and children, that's true. So 70,000, I was just going to make a note in here. 70,000 men. So God thought that was pretty serious what David did. Capital C, understanding this covenant with David. Number 1, who made the covenant and why? Again, Jehovah searches for a faithful person. He reveals himself as Jehovah Ra to the shepherd boy who later writes, the Lord is my shepherd, the one who cares and protects me from my enemies. So God revealed himself to David as Jehovah Ra, the one who takes care of and protects me from my enemies. Number 2, the words of the covenant. The covenant is an irrevocable, unconditional agreement, again building on previous covenants. So it's irrevocable in the fact that God said, through David, kings would come. Has that happened? Did that happen? Yes. Unconditional. He was going to bless them and bless them and bless them. Remember, the conditional agreement was with Joshua over the land. So Joshua's was a conditional agreement that if they broke the Sabbath, if they turned to idolatry, God would remove them from the land. So under David's covenant, it was an unconditional agreement that he would bless them and multiply them and grow them, and he did. The promises. Jehovah's major promise is that of establishing a seed, a house, a throne, and an eternal kingdom. Everlasting kingship is the central theme, fulfilled in Jesus as the Son of David. And the Lord shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. The overview of the covenant continues. God says, is not my house right with God? Has he not made with me an everlasting covenant, arranged and secured in every part, that he not bring to fruition my salvation and grant me my every desire? David and his descendants were given more stable, appointed land and ordained place, filled when Israel returned to the land after their captivity. They were given victory over their enemies. David regained the lands that were lost and conquered all the land promised to Abraham in 2 Chronicles. David's victories also point to the spiritual victories of Christ as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Then the third major promise, an unbroken dynasty of kings from David's line. Jehovah built David's dynasty with an unbroken line from Solomon to Zedekiah, 20 kings in all. It's interesting to note that none of the kings from the northern kingdom of Israel were of David's seed. So when the 10 tribes broke off from Judah, none of them were of David's royal line. So none of them were of David's seed. Now we've got a problem, because is there an unbroken dynasty all the way down to today, or dynasty, whichever way you want to say? No. So we have a problem, because history says that there is not the unbroken line. So somewhere along the line we've got a problem. 3 theories exist as to David's kingly line now. First, removal from the land meant God's promises were revocable. So all the promises of having a king that would go on and on and on and on through David's line, since it was broken and God removed them from the land, that part was revocable. Or, secondly, the spiritual fulfillment is now in the Messiah, in his rule. Or thirdly, David's line was transferred by marriage into the secular British descendants of today. Well, some of it depends on your theology. Because when the 10 tribes went into captivity, somewhere in history, 10 of the tribes are still lost. History doesn't record what happened to the 10 tribes of Israel. So, some people have put together the story, and I have to be careful because there is some merit to the whole thing, that the 10 tribes went on to go into the Scottish, Irish, English inheritance countries we see today. So that the English people of today are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And that's called British Israelism. So if you run across someone who says that, it's like then the spiritual Israel then has become not only us who believe in Jesus, but also the English race down through the ages. Anybody run across that view before?
Why if they're the ones from the 10 lost tribes, they're not the tribes of Judah?
That's true.
Well, wouldn't they be really more the spiritual Israel?
That's where the Messiah came through, was through Judah. So the spiritual line has come through Judah. That's when you go back to the 3 theories. That's where I stand. Is that the spiritual fulfillment is now in the Messiah, is in Jesus. So there doesn't have to be a practical fulfillment of having a king that goes all the way back to King David. But it's now Jesus.
If they're not Judah, if they're Israel, and there was no kingly line
through Israel.
So how could it?
Yeah. Well, it's easy to see some of the flaws in the argument. Yes.
Doesn't the book of Matthew open up for all of the gaps?
Matthew accounts for all the gaps, but not the king's gaps. So some of David's line, you could say, well, okay, like, well, turn over to the timeline, because I did put a timeline in for you today. So the line, let's go back to, actually, how about, it's time for break. How about let's stop at that point, we'll pick that up, because that might take a bit longer than just our break time. So let's take a break. We're going to talk about the timeline. So turn over to page 7, Appendix A, the timeline continues. Where we were in the past, we talked about Abram in the year 2000 BC. Ishmael was born, Isaac born of Abraham and Sarah. Then 2168, Esau and Jacob born. Conflict continued. Jacob leaves. 2315, Jacob, now called Israel, has 12 sons and 1 daughter. Jacob, his sons, joined Joseph in Egypt. Then somewhere 200 years later, or 150 years later, Moses was born and then grew up and was sent to Israel to bring Israel out of Egypt. So that brings us up to where we are with Joshua. 1300 BC, Israel's in the wilderness. Joshua, the books of Joshua, Numbers, and Chronicles. Moses was given the law at Mount Sinai, tabernacle, spies sent to Canaan, idolatry with the golden calf, the brazen serpent is a cure, covenant with Joshua. Moses died. Joshua and the people enter the land. Jericho's conquered. The Canaan land is divided into the 12 tribes. And Israel continues to conquer the land and their enemies. That brings us up to somewhere around 1200 BC. The Israelites would sin against God. Jehovah would allow their enemies to come against them as punishment. Remember, that happened 7 major times. The people would cry out to him, and he would raise up a judge to deliver them from the hands of their enemies. And during that time, there was 2 judges that were given. 1200 BC, the judges continue in the books of Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And then down to 1100 BC, the kingdom age begins in 2nd Samuel and 1st Kings, and that's where we were tonight with David and Saul and Solomon. So at 1095, Saul becomes Israel's first king. David slays Goliath, hides in the caves, Jonathan is killed, and Saul is slain in battle. 1055, David becomes king of Israel. The ark starts the journey to Jerusalem. And even just the Ark of the Covenant, in reading that book, it's a fascinating story of how the Ark was begun and how it finally ended up where it was. And then if you watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, it ends up where?
In a storehouse somewhere.
In a big storehouse somewhere. I don't think that's exactly scriptural, but because when they went into captivity, the Ark and all the material, the utensils, all the furniture from the covenant and the temple of Solomon was all destroyed and lost. So somewhere in history, the Ark of the Covenant came into enemy hands, and what's happened to it is still an unknown factor, unless you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. In 1015, Solomon becomes king. David dies. Solomon builds Jehovah his temple. Solomon took 1 wife, 700 wives, and 3,000 concubines. 300, sorry. Don't make it worse than it is, Susan. 300 concubines. He would have to have been a very active man. 975, due to a stupid man, would be able to come into the king's bedchamber. That's true.
It would have taken years.
And so the whole life of the harem, of all the intrigue and anyhow. 975, due to leadership problems, the kingdom is divided at Solomon's death. The northern kingdom, called Israel, the 10 tribes, and these are the kings that ruled over the northern kingdom of Israel. And none of them came through the tribe of Judah, because Judah went into the southern kingdom to become Judah, to be called Judah. Benjamin and Judah stayed together as the 2 tribes, and they were called Judah. So there's the list of the kings from Jeroboam all the way to the last Hosea, and that was into the captivity period. 915, Elijah conflicts with the prophets of Baal, Jezebel, Ahab, Elisha, continues as Jehovah's prophet. And then somewhere around 915, Israel goes into captivity. The southern kingdom, called Judah, again was of the 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, and there was some 20 kings from Rehoboam all the way down to Zedekiah. And it was interesting that they had cycles. Judah was involved in repeated cycles of good kings, but what was the main thing that God said about the good kings? They didn't tear down the high places. So they might have been good in their government of the people and the welfare of the people and taking care of the people's needs, but they didn't return the people back to worship of God. So they kept all the pagan idols, the pagan temples, all the sacrifices to the pagan gods going. So they were a good king, but they didn't tear down the high places. Along with the wicked kings who led the people deeper and deeper and deeper into idolatry and Jehovah's judgment, until finally at 586 to 536, Judah goes into captivity to Babylon, and the temple is completely destroyed. 586, the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel's stand in the fiery furnace, King Nebuchadnezzar eats grass, Daniel's stay in the lion's den, Zerubbabel returns to rebuild the temple and to rebuild Jerusalem. During the captivity, I didn't realize this, but during the captivity, the 2 kingdoms were reunited. In BC, the kings of Israel resumed their line, Ezra to Malachi, Zechariah, Nehemiah, and Malachi. Esther becomes king, 478. Haman is hanged, the Feast of Purim is started. Ezra returns to build the temple, then Nehemiah returns to build the walls of Jerusalem. And that's the point where the Old Testament ends its account of history. There's some 400 years from the return of Nehemiah and some of the Jewish people to rebuild the walls to the coming of Jesus. And those are called the silent years.
They didn't want any of the ones in the northern kingdom to come back, did they, when they went to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem?
There was a big controversy, yes, between who could come and who wouldn't. There was a lot of national rivalry going on even at that point. Were very selective on who actually did come back, yes. And when they came back, they found the Jews that were left behind, the Israelites that were left behind, had intermarried with some of the other pagan tribes, and thus the Samaritans had gotten started. So the Jews were very biased and prejudiced against the Samaritans because they felt they had intermarried and polluted the Jewish race while they were in captivity. Probably was a matter of survival for some of them, but that's why the Jews and the Samaritans had such conflicts even in Jesus' day. Any other comments about the timeline?
Is there any reason why there's nothing recorded after that 400 years?
Well, there were probably various historians, like the Maccabees would have been in there, or some of the other minor historians, and perhaps all their work was lost during the Romans.
It may have been just a recording of history without any so much of God's hand.
That's true. Where probably nothing major happened.
He's already set the foundation down to that.
Yes, for the Messiah to come. Yeah. So it could have just been a time period where they just continued to try to build Israel and the walls and Jerusalem and get back on their feet again, but certainly never getting to the heights of the glory of Solomon's days. Now, where did we get up to? Capital C. We did number 1, who made the covenant, the words, the promises, the unbroken dynasty, the three theories. Then the fourth promise that was made to David was the promise of sure mercies when David's seed committed iniquity. Chastisement resulted, but Jehovah would not take his mercy from them, which is probably one reason why Israel sinned time after time after time after time. With all the different kings and all the different prophets, God was still very, very patient with Israel, probably because of David, the sure mercies that he had promised. Then the fifth major promise, through prophecies, David's seed would come the Messiah. So from David's line would come the Messiah. And then sixth, that Jehovah would allow David's son to build him a temple and a seed house. And that happened with Solomon. Even though David got most of the material together before Solomon began, it was actually Solomon that did the building of the temple. As with the other covenants, faith and obedience are the main objectives of Jehovah, laying a foundation for the new covenant believers. So we see faith and obedience all the way back to Adam and Eve. So do you suppose with God, faith and obedience are important? I reckon so. He's laid it again and again and again and again as a major foundation of faith and obedience. Capital D, other parts to the covenant. Other parts of the covenant. Number 1, the oath of the covenant. The oath of the covenant. Jehovah confirmed this covenant with an oath, making some part of it irrevocable, such as the promises about the kingship dynasty of David. Other parts of the covenant were revocable if Israel and their kings did not obey Jehovah. The book containing the agreement is not specified at the time of David's anointing, but prophecy containing this is found in the Pentateuch. And the Pentateuch is a Jewish word meaning the first 5 books in the Bible. They call it the Pentateuch. Number 2, the sacrifice to ratify the agreement. The sacrifice. Second Samuel 6:17-18 and 2 Samuel 7:1-3 shows sacrificial blood was shed. With great joy, David returns the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. David gave tremendous offerings of thanksgiving and praise in their celebration. So David didn't just do the animal sacrifices that he'd been required to, and that was it. He did praise and worship and thanksgiving sacrifices. And of course, that's another type for us today of praise and thanksgiving worship to the Lord. The seal of the covenant. With each of the covenants, since each of the covenants had a separate physical outward sign or seal, the sign of the sun, moon, and stars were the token or seal for this covenant. Jehovah promised David that his seed, house, throne, and kingdom would endure as long as the sun and the moon remained. So is the sun and the moon still there? So his covenant line says that there is still his seed, his house, his throne around. It's still in existence. And of course, if we say that that's Jesus the Messiah, then certainly Jesus is everlasting. The mediator of the covenant, David acted as priest-king along with the Levitical priesthood, foreshadowing the role of the Messiah and the priesthood of all believers that we find in the New Covenant. 5, the place of the covenant, the holy place. The order of service began with Moses in the tabernacle. David was led by God to establish a separate tabernacle on Mount Zion called David's tabernacle. He brought the ark and the celebrations into it. It was here that the ceremonies of animal sacrifices were offered. Then going through the history, we find Mount Zion then becomes the political and religious center of David's kingdom. So Moses had his tabernacle, and when David came into power, God had him move it to Mount Zion. So it was like a new beginning for David and his worship as well. How are we doing? Everybody getting a little bit lost in all of this? It is. When I did a lot of these studies when I was in Bible college, and then we rewrote the diploma course as a correspondence course for the Bible college, and we picked up a lot of Kevin Conner's books and actually did the covenant. It was really faith building, I found, because it was line upon line. You just saw the patterns repeated again and again and again and again, so that you knew that there was no accident in the way things that were put together. It was sovereign design of God. You just see the pattern again and again and again and again of the need for Jesus to come, the salvation through faith, the salvation through obedience, the cleansing process, sanctification. Just goes on and on and on through all the different parts of the covenants. So I found it was very faith-building the first time I did this. I've probably learned more from this than you guys have, because I've really enjoyed putting it together. Capital E, conclusions of this covenant. The conclusions of this covenant. Beg your pardon? Conclusions. I expanded it. Conclusions. David's covenant conditions and promises are clearly Messiah-related. Christ himself is the ultimate fulfillment of this covenant, ushering in promises for himself and to his spiritual descendants. He will return a second time to begin reign as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. With David's covenant, there's a sense of building toward the completion of Jehovah's plans with regard to the land. The New Testament church becomes the land of the Lord as Jesus plants, builds, and gifts us through the Holy Spirit. We no longer look for a holy land, but for a holy person. Next week, the covenant is with the seed, with the Messiah as the promised one. He is the one sent through the seed of the woman. God promises to redeem mankind, to judge Satan, and to heal the traumatic wounds for the whole of mankind. Yet wait, another covenant follows, the everlasting covenant. And that's the two covenants that we'll pick up on next Tuesday night. Any comments? Then we probably need to go back and have you do some of your filling in the chart, just so I make sure I don't lose you totally and completely. So go back to this. It was back in session 3. Covenant 5 was what? Made with Moses. That's right. What were Moses' promises? A little bit louder. If you obey the law, you will be blessed. And if you don't, you will be cursed. Very clear, black and white. God spelled it out, put it in writing, had a whole priesthood that would have spent months and months and months learning all the different kinds of sacrifices, all the different tongs and tables and equipment, etc., 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 to carry out the sacrifices. So if you obey the words of the covenant, you will be blessed, and if you do not obey the words of the covenant, you will be cursed. Remember, the people were between the two mountains, and God said, on one hand, and then on the other hand. And so by doing that, he showed the people that you could choose that one or you could choose that one. And that the choice was the people's. They could make that choice. The blood sacrifice was?
Sacrificing the animals.
Sacrificing the animals. So they began the temple system at that point, and they sacrificed the animals. The seal, what was Moses' seal for his covenant? This is Trivial Pursuit. What was Moses given as a sign of his covenant? No, that was part of the promises. He was given the seal of the seventh day, the Sabbath day. God told his people to take the seventh day and rest. So Moses was given the seventh day as a seal for his covenant. Foundations for the next covenant. What could we learn out of Moses' covenant that we could apply to the Messiah? I lost you, Maria. You okay?
I haven't done 2 yet, and we're doing 3.
Okay, we're on to number 5. What did we learn from Moses' covenant?
That was where the priests came in.
That's when the priesthood came in. All the Levites set up all the rules, the ceremonies, all the regulations. Yes? Do we have that today?
No.
In Jesus, that's right. Jesus met the whole Levitical priesthood. So the main thing that we can learn out of Moses' covenant is that we cannot keep the law. That even though it's spelled out for us in black and white and has 13, I'm sure that people felt that way, 13 million laws about what to do and what not to do, they still could not do it. God told them exactly what he required from them, and people still could not do it because their heart was not changed. So the biggest thing we can learn from Moses' law is that we can't keep law, and that we need God's grace because we're not perfect. Number 6, what was the 6th covenant? Joshua, that's right, Joshua. And Joshua's covenant mainly had to do with conquering the promised land. So his blessings, the words...
Wherever your feet.
Sorry, keep going.
Isn't it wherever your feet tread, Michelle?
So wherever their feet trod, that's where they picked up that land. They conquered that land. So he was given the land. The people were given the land. And it wasn't just any old hunk of earth. It was God's land. He regarded it as his land, so they were just stewards of the land, partakers. So the words of the covenant is that he would be with them, he would help them if they did what? Stayed away from the idolatry of the pagan nations. He told them to completely conquer the land, sweep out all of the Canaanites. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they made bargains with them, sometimes they made pacts with them, sometimes they just kept certain things where God said not to, but there was a long history of disobedience in the whole thing. Blood sacrifice, yes, there was lots of sacrifices when Joshua went into the land. Celebration sacrifices. Joshua's seal was what? The 7th year and the year of Jubilee. That's right. So the seal of Joshua's covenant, God told him to have the 7th year off. And since we did that last week, I've been thinking a little bit about the extravagance of God, to be able to so bless his people that the 6 years they could work hard, and on the 7th year nobody had to work. Wouldn't that have been amazing? Just the storehouses would have been so full, the land would have been just so fruitful, just so blessed, that everybody could take the 7th year off.
Yes, just have a holiday.
Have a holiday.
Obviously didn't work to a just-in-time program.
That's true, and they didn't do it. They couldn't keep it up. Foundations for the next covenant. What do we learn from Joshua? Anything you can remember that you picked up out of the Joshua covenant? Well, Joshua was a mighty man of valor. He fought his enemies well. So that pictures who fighting their enemies? Jesus, only fighting the enemies for us. So Joshua was a type of Jesus through the whole thing. So conquering the land, taking the spiritual land that God gives us, our own promised land. And of course that gets built into the covenant with David, because David was also a mighty man of valor, of military victories. Covenant number 7 was with David, and that's who we talked about tonight. So David's words of his covenant were about what? See, I think I'm too easy on you. I should have had you divide into groups and find the answers to all these things. Sorry? Huh?
The everlasting kingship.
An everlasting kingship, that through David a king would be raised up that would reign forever and ever and ever, and a few more thousand forevers in there as well. And of course that's the Messiah, Jesus. Blood sacrifices. Did David make sacrifices? Yes, huge numbers of thanksgiving, worship sacrifices. In fact, he got so involved in the praise and the worship of Jehovah that he danced into the city with the Ark of the Covenant, and his first wife did what? She despised him. Now remember, a lot of people dump on poor Michael. Some people say Michael, but Michal. Actually, it was Michal by their pronunciation. But remember, she was the one that was back with David when David and Jonathan began their friendship. And it sounds like she just gave her whole heart to David. So she loved him right from when he was this young king, young shepherd boy coming into the palace with Jonathan. What happened when David left, ran away from King Saul? What happened to her? She was given to someone else. So much for this mighty man of valor that didn't even come and rescue his first wife from the fate that awaited her. But when David was going to become king, he said he wanted her back again. So one of the conditions was that she be brought back to him. Now who knows where she was during those time period, whether she was in love with her husband, whether she was happily married and grandmother and 5 dozen grandkids by then, and here she was pulled out of where she was, where she'd established her own life, and now came back to David. So it's hard to know what was happening in her heart. Could have been a lot of bitterness and anger toward David, and it was out of that she despised David in the way that he danced before the Lord, and so he never went back to her again. He never slept with her, and she never had any children. So it's interesting, even that's interesting, to take some of the women of the Old Testament and compare them, how they followed their heart, how they followed what they knew was right from wrong. But she probably died a very bitter old woman. It's really sad.
Her husband really loved her, apparently, didn't he?
It's possible. Yes, he tried to get her back, and so it could have been she had a very happy life with this new husband, with a new that King Saul had given her to, and so she didn't want to come back and be the queen, the wife of David. And by then, lots of things had happened to David. So interesting study. Anyhow. So blood sacrifices, yes, David offered lots of praise and worship and thanksgiving. The seal, what was David's seal? The sun and the moon and the stars. As long as the sun and the moon and the stars were in heaven, his throne would be established. Then foundations for the next covenant, we could pick out all kinds of things. Certainly the worship, the praise, the heart change. I think David's heart was really changed, really touched by God many, many, many times. So his repentant heart was a good start for the next covenant to come through. Okay, get all of that down in your own words. Sorry? You may have my copy, Maria.
Oh, there's nothing on it.
There's nothing on it. Because I forgot to tell you, this is part of your final exam at the end of the year. Okay, so next week we're going to talk about the new covenant in Jesus. The new covenant in Jesus, and then the everlasting covenant is the one that we finish up on for the term, for the unit. Any last minute questions? Yes, next week is number 5. Well, we didn't have time to do a workshop for this session. So workshop is the everlasting covenant and the covenant with Jesus.
Which is another week.
Sorry?
Is it another week?
So there is no workshop with this unit.
What about the Thursday one?
Thursday night, yes. Okay, how about I pray for you and then... Would you like some prayer, Jean?
I would like some.
Okay, how about I pray for everybody and then Maria would like some prayer and then we can go pray for Jean as well because we've still got about 5 minutes. Okay, well, Lord Jesus, you can be seen in so much of the Old Testament story. And the perfection of God comes through again in David's covenant. Lord, continue to open our eyes to see your perfection, to see your plan in history. Because, Lord, I know that you have a plan for each one of us as well. You have not abandoned us here in the last days. So, Lord, continue to open our eyes to see where you are in the Old Testament and the New Testament scriptures. I ask your blessings on each person here, Lord. Continue to teach us and draw us closer to you, Lord. In your precious name, amen.